Well, good morning, everyone. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and this year we're celebrating the culture and geographic regions in the United States, and during week 10 of the lecture series, we'll explore the region of the U.S. known as the West Coast. And this region is a diverse and dynamic region. It stretches along the Pacific Ocean. Its sweeping vistas combine ocean horizons, fertile valleys, desert expanses, and some of the nation's most iconic national parks, creating scenery of exceptional natural beauty and variety. And today's presenter, Rustin Levinson, will share an adventure story associated with one of Albert Bierstein's most famous paintings, The Domes of Yosemite. Rusty is an author and art conservator. She worked as a conservationist for the Canadian Conservation Institute, the National Gallery of Canada Conservation Institute, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then opened her own business, Art Care Conservation, with studios in New York City, Miami, and Los Angeles, where her studio teams treat paintings from museums, private and corporate collections. And she's also a Lakesider. I would ask you to please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming Rusty Levinson.
Thanks, John. Everybody can hear me? I'll try not to be too loud. So as John said, one of the paintings I've treated is Albert Bierstadt's Domes of Yosemite. And when you work on a painting, especially one that's 10 feet by 15 feet, you see every inch of it, and you really spend a lot of time thinking about the artist, how he painted it, why he painted it, how it came about as a work of art. And that led me to thinking about art and the West. When the West opened, it was just a blank space, and people in the East were so curious about it. And I'm going to talk a little about how art helped with the opening of the West. Even in Europe, people were really interested in what was happening in the United States. Alexis de Tocqueville, who came over from France and wrote a book about America, or at least his opinions about America. And what he said was the whole continent, in short, seemed prepared to be the abode of a great nation, yet unborn. And this slide demonstrates that because, look at that. I mean, you're living out here, and all that is there. You're like, what is that? What's going on? And what's out there? It wasn't like there was the internet or airplanes or anything. You really had no idea if you were living here what was happening. And at the same time, the nation was expanding. There were 30 states, and all of a sudden, by 1890, there were 14 more states. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the excitement of adding Hawaii and Alaska as a state. How thrilling it was, more states, and I can only imagine what it must have been like for people living there as more and more states were added. Of course, those who know the history of the Civil War know that adding states became a big problem and did lead in the end to the Civil War. But I have no pictures of the Civil War, so we're not going to talk about that. So this slide fascinates me. This is where the population was in 1860. And the very dark spots are 90 people per square mile, or over 90. And that's like in Lakeside, if we had 90 people here, it would be overpopulated. So, and you can imagine there's just little areas of population where there were 2 to 6 or under 2 people in the United States. And all the people here, again, the curiosity about what was out there must have been enormous. This dark area represents the gold rush and the rush on the silver mines, which also provided a lot of excitement. one of the theories of the time, coined by journalist John L. O'Sullivan, was manifest destiny. And it ended up being a legacy of colonialism and violence. It justified the westward expansion, it justified the killing and displacement of Native Americans and all the territorial acquisition that occurred. And while some of it was a wonderful idea, a lot of it was brutal and led to a lot of unhappiness. This picture, painted in 1872, kind of represents the bringing of light to the darkness of the West. And the West wasn't that dark, but the feeling was they were going to make it better, and you can see the light here and the dark here. The West is unenlightened. They're going to make it, they're going to improve things. What could go wrong? There's a lot of imperialism, and this imperialist nostalgia extended to Europe. Here we have the Iowa Indians performing their dance before the king at the Galerie de Paix at the Tuileries Palace. I mean, they brought the Indians over, they did their dance. It wasn't an easy performance, but the interest was really there in Europe. The religious fervor, which I mentioned before, is demonstrated in this painting, Advice on the Prairie, 1853, by William Rainey and Ranney. And you can see there, you get the sense of the Madonna and Child, Jesus and the disciples. The iconography of this painting really presents the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to explore and dominate the entire continent. There was a lot of optimism and avarice in the exploration of the West, and I love these posters. What is my thing given out? I love these posters. The central one, if you want to get to California in these days, you take a steamship, as you can imagine, and you go by Nicaragua, and you get there in, 35 days on a steamship. But the reason you're going is you're going to the gold regions. And this was a huge deal. When gold was found in Sutter's mine in California, Sutter's Creek in California, it galvanized the people of the East and people who were hoping for an opportunity to get real gold. And in 1849, when gold was discovered, the West was not accessible, as this demonstrates. It wasn't until 1869 that the first transcontinental railroad found its way to the West. There was a lot of curiosity about the West. Travelers like Mr. Illingsworth would give lectures. You could go and he would tell you all about his adventures in the West. And especially, I don't know who saw the movie sometime before COVID, Grizzly Adams was someone that everyone knew about because he would tame bears and give them to the circus or the carnival. He didn't get eaten, but he did, I don't know how he tamed bears, but that wasn't in a painting, so I can't tell you. But there he is. One of my favorites, because he was one of the leaders of Bierstadt's adventure in the West, was Fitzhugh Ludlow. And he was such a character an interesting character of the 19th century. He led several exhibitions, and he was a writer. So he would send articles and dispatches to the Post, to San Francisco's newspaper, and especially to the Atlantic Monthly. And if you go to the library, even today, you can look up Fitzhugh Ludlow's descriptions of his travels. Albert Bierstadt and his brothers were among the artists and photographers who accompanied him west. All right, I have to tell you a little more about him because he's so interesting. He was the son of an abolitionist preacher, and his childhood home was a station in the Underground Railroad. He was sickly, and he spent much of his time at the pharmacist. and became addicted to heroin and hashish. And he wrote a whole autobiography called The Hashish Eaters in 1857, which was republished in the 60s, 1960s. And he was friends with all the interesting people of the time: Mark Twain, Bret Harte, Walt Whitman, and Albert Bierstadt. And there's more. These are Albert Bierstadt's travels. His first trip was with Colonel Frederick Lander, who led an expedition to Nebraska and Wyoming. And he wrote that Albert Bierstadt and other artists accompanied him and recorded the remarkable views along their travels. Then he went with Fitzhugh Ludlow in 1863. And you're going to see one of his paintings is called Mount Rosalie. Rosalie was married to Ludlow, but when they came back from the exhibition, they were divorced and Bierstadt married her. It was an interesting trip, and we're still friends, apparently. In 1847, stereoscopic photography became available. And you can imagine how this fascinated people, because if you've ever looked through a stereoscope, you get a three-dimensional view of, say, these mountains or whatever they take pictures of. Bierstadt had two brothers who were photographers, and Muybridge, Edward Muybridge, who photography historians talk about a lot, went on this exhibition and took lots of photographs, which became a source for the artists later. And here they are in these two stereoscopic pictures. It looks like a tough trip, right? You know, there were no Motel 6s out there. And walked and horses and whatever. One of the things that people were curious about in the West was the buffalo. There weren't a lot of buffalo in the eastern seaboard. And Bierstadt was very interested in studying and painting the buffaloes. I'm going to read this. They wanted to give Bierstadt a chance to paint a buffalo charging. So they had wounded a buffalo. This is really terrible. They'd wounded a buffalo and set up this staged thing where Bierstadt was going to paint the buffalo. So they said, Bierstadt, here comes the buffalo. So Bierstadt leapt up from his buggy. Out came the materials of success following him. And in a trifle of 3 minutes from his first halt, the big blue umbrella was pointed, pitched, and he sat under it on his camp stool with his color box on his knees, his brush and his palette in hand, and a clean board pinned to the cover of his color box. Ludlow and two other men taunted the buffalo so that Bierstadt may see him in action. So here's a painting by Bierstadt called The Last of the Buffalo. I don't know if this is the one that was staged, but it's a sad story. And it gets sadder. Here's some of Bierstadt's sketches of buffalo that he made on his trip. This work is at the Gilchrist Museum of Art. These studies are from 1870, so after his trip. And this is the sad part of the story. These are buffalo skulls outside Michigan Carbon Works, New Rougeville, Michigan, where the skulls were processed to make charcoal glue and fertilizer. In the late 18th century, vast herds of buffalo were estimated between 30 and 60 million. And by 1892, there were 456 buffalo. So even though they found them interesting, they didn't take very good care of them. The other fascinating aspect, which I mentioned before, were the Native Americans. People didn't know quite how to relate to them. Thomas McKinney was the head of Bureau of Indian Affairs for 7 years, and he believed the Native American culture was nearing extinction, So he commissioned Charles Bird King to make portraits of the chiefs and the Indians that visited the presidents of the United States. I think there are over 90 of these pictures, which most of the Indians are in full regalia with their headwear, necklaces, and everything. But when Jackson came in, Thomas McKinney had some sympathy for the Indians, but when Jackson came in, he believed that the Indians were in the way, let's get rid of them. Thomas McKinney lost his job, and no more Charles Bird King paintings. They recorded a lot of their impressions of the Native Americans. We've taken many stereoscopic views, but not so many of mountain scenery as I could wish, owing to various obstacles attached to the pieces, but still a goodly number. We have a great many Indian subjects. We were quite fortunate in getting them, the natives not being very willing to have a brass tube with the camera pointed at them, as you can imagine. Of course, they were astonished when we showed them pictures they did not sit for. The best we have taken have been obtained without the knowledge of the parties, which is, he says, the best way to take any portrait, but not exactly fair to the subjects. And here are some of Bierstadt's studies of Indians. And I love this picture because this is Albert Bierstadt, the stereo twice. And you can see he's got his little easel there, no blue umbrella that was described in the previous slide. But you can see sitting there, and here are the two Native Americans stolidly sitting for their portraits. We often meet the Indians, and they have always been kindly disposed to us, and we to them. But it's a little risky, because being very superstitious and naturally distrustful, who can blame them? Their friendship may turn into hate at any moment. This is a painting Albert Bierstadt painted in the 1900 in a private collection, and to show that by 1800, the population of Native Americans was about 600,000, and by 1890, almost 2/3 of the population had vanished. So the Indians and the buffalo, wonderful subjects, but kind of sad story. Here he is back in his studio. I don't know how many of you are artists, but if you sat there and you had 4 people watching you, right behind you, watching you paint, you might be a little nervous, but I've seen this painting, Thunderstorm in the Rocky Mountains, and it looks good. And you can actually see, here's a stereoscopic image that he's using to paint the picture. Also, top hats. I mean, usually you see an artist in a sweatshirt or whatever, but no, a tie, a coat, it's a different time. The grand paintings that Bierstadt made were the representations of the American West that really impressed the Easterners. They were called the grand paintings because they were really big. The biggest one, Domes of Yosemite, was almost 10 by 15 feet. And these are the paintings. Just to give you an idea, this is Rocky Mountain Landers Peak. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Isn't that amazing? It's such a beautiful picture. It's 6 feet by 10 feet. So you can stand in front of it and feel like you're there. And in this painting, he had a Shoshone encampment, which made this especially interesting to the people in the East who had no reason to see what Indians were. The manners and customs of the Indians are still as they were hundreds of years ago, and now is the time to paint them, for they are rapidly passing away, and soon will be known only in history. I think the artist ought to tell his portion of their history as well as the writer. A combination of both will assuredly render it more complete. You can think about that for a minute. This painting in the Metropolitan Museum, I used to work at the Met, so I'm very familiar with it. It's sold, but it was sold in London. That's how much the interest extended to Europe. sold for $25,000, and AI told me that that's $514,000 in our current currency. It was praised for the light and its artistic merit, and it even won a prize at the Universal Exposition in Paris. This work is now at the Met, as I said, but it lived for a long time in Europe. Storm in the Rocky Mountains, Mount Rosalie. You know that story, right? Mount Rosalie, if you're going out in the West now, is not called Mount Rosalie anymore. It was named later for John Evans, who was governor of Colorado, but it turned out, the Colorado Territory, but it turned out he wasn't a very good guy. So looking back in 2023, the mountain was renamed Blue Sky. It's kind of a weird name for a mountain, but we were lucky that colleagues of ours were working on Storm in the Rocky Mountains when we were working, the same time we were working on Domes of Yosemite. And here's two of our colleagues, just to give you a sense of the size of the frame and the size of the painting. 7 feet by 15 feet, it's big. Again, there's some details of Native Americans in this painting, but as he painted the larger paintings, they became more about the landscape and less about the Native Americans or anybody, the buffalo or anyone out there, because I think part of it was they wanted to show that the West is there for taking. There it is, all empty, and it could be all yours. This painting, I don't know if any of you are from Philadelphia, Cincinnati, or Milwaukee, but this painting actually 5 foot by 8 foot trained its way around the country and was seen by hundreds of people. This one was sold, it ended out in Chicago in the Opera House, which was destroyed by a fire. And it was bought for $20,000, $415,000. I keep looking this up because I think it's interesting to try and compare. By Uranus H. Crosby. I don't know whether he had brothers and sisters named Pluto and Mars, but anyway. And then after the fire, it was moved. Crosby moved it to the Art Institute, to his home. But then in 1929, it was purchased for $300. So you can see that the prices of these were considered so precious early on, but later on went for less money. And this was also the case of the Domes of Yosemite. This was the last large painting. He finished it in 1867, and it rests at the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum in Vermont. It's definitely the largest and a very grand painting. It was, again, this was a few years later, so we're up even $566,000. LeGrand Lockwood, his parents had big ambitions for him, I'm pretty sure. He was a member of the New York Stock Exchange, and he was constructing a 44,000 square foot house, like we all have, you know. There's many bedrooms, and I actually went to it, which was so fun. It's in Norwalk, Connecticut, and it's still a historic site. People can visit it. And in the Grand Chamber, this is a picture of the domes in the Grand Chamber where it rested briefly. They made chromolithographs also of the domes of Yosemite, and these were very popular, and especially popular apparently as wedding gifts. So if you knew someone getting married, you would spend $25 or $635 to get them a chromolithograph of the domes of Yosemite. Now the editions do sell for a lot more money, $10,000 to $30,000. The domes of Yosemite was really interesting to us. It traveled a lot. It traveled from New York to Philadelphia to Boston to Buffalo, and then it went to London, England. And I'd never seen this before. When we turned it over, it was held around the edge with laces. And you can see here the grommet and the laces. We were guessing it was because they were taking it on and off the easel so often. I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine lacing that. I can barely tie my shoe, but someone did that. And of course, always curious, I had to see, well, when did they have grommets? It seems so modern. Turns out they invented grommets, ladies, for corsets. Ugh. The travel of domes of Yosemite was reported endlessly in papers all over the country. And this one was especially interesting to me because it said, the dimensions of this great painting are such that the sides of the car in which it made the journey from Boston to Buffalo had to be opened to admit it. I mean, we take care of paintings, so we wonder, why is that tear there? And I think if it traveled in an open car from Boston to Buffalo, that could explain it. Finally, Lockwood Mansion was ready. It took 2 years beyond when the work was while the work was touring, and it was reported all over the country. In Iowa, that the Bierstadts was going to Lockwood's, and this is the rest of the story. Like I said, it's in the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum in Vermont, and within 6 years of receiving the domes of Yosemite, LeGrand, Lockwood, had declared bankruptcy and passed away. Industrials, and remember, $25,000, Industrials Horace Fairbanks purchased the canvas in an estate auction for $5,000 and donated it to the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum, where it is today. In 2017, our team at Art Care Conservation was selected to treat the domes of Yosemite, which, there we are, very excited. And they started noticing that something was really wrong because all along this side, the painting was literally falling off the stretcher. And you can see here, well, wait a minute. I don't know how to show you. There we go. You can see here where the canvas is just torn right around the tacking edge. So the reason it was sagging and the reason they decided to have it restored. It had been treated a few times before, but only for minor things. So we did emergency repairs. We strengthened the tacking edges. And then we put a facing on it. Facing is a Japan paper attached with rice starch paste to protect the surface of the painting while it traveled. And obviously, it was too big to fit in my Suburban. And it still wouldn't fit in my Suburban, but we rolled it. And that's often how larger paintings are transported. They're rolled on a large sonotube, face out, and you can see here, we're rolling up the domes in preparation to get it to our studio in Miami. We decided to treat it in Miami. We have a studio in New York and one in LA also. But we decided to treat it in Miami because Horace Fairbanks turns out to have been a relative of the founder of the Morse Museum in Winter Park, Florida. And in honor of that, the museum and the foundation, Morse Foundation, paid for a lot of the conservation, and with the proviso that we let them exhibit it on its way back to Vermont. So it was just, our New York studio didn't have 20-foot ceilings. So. And here it is in our Miami studio, and you can see the size of it. It just fit. Luckily, we have high ceilings. Took off the grime, and you can see here, this is just surface dirt. It's surprising how much grime and dust that come in on the visitors to a museum. And this is, we have people I say, well, what did you use to clean it? And these are the test solutions up on the top. And the test solutions include different pH, different electric charge, all kinds of things that unlock dirt. When dirt is that old, it can have everything in it from smoke. People used to smoke at the museum. And it can have all kinds of things in it that, just like a key, you have to have all the elements in an aqueous solution to unlock the dirt. And there was a lot of it. When we took off the varnish, let's see, and you can see here, this is the area where there's varnish. It was quite yellowed, and this is the area where the varnish is taken away, showing a mountain or a stream that's not yellow at all. But one of the quotes about the painting was, it's a wonderful landscape, no, not man or beast. And we discovered a bird. When you're working on a painting inch by inch by inch, it's often not surprising to discover something that no one saw before, but here was this bird perched on the branch. Interestingly, I went to Birmingham Museum of Art to see Looking Down Yosemite Valley, which I showed before, and they had loaned the painting to the National Gallery, and when it was on loan, they had cleaned it, and guess what they found? A bird. The curator said the bird was a symbol of hope for the future after the rigors of the Civil War. But that's a curator. You never know whether they're right or not. But anyway, it was really fun. So, of course, the phone lines were buzzing. We found a bird. We found a bird. We treated the back of the painting by adding another canvas. The canvas was obviously 100 and some years old, 60 years old, and it really needed reinforcement. If you've ever seen even an old dress, fabric does not last that long, and especially oil paint has an acidic component that degrades it. So here we are, putting it face down and putting the new canvas on the back and then lifting it up. It required a lot of strategy. Not the biggest one we've ever lined, but one of them. The next step was retouching, just taking the areas of loss and toning them to make the painting perfect. And there it is after treatment. You can applaud. So when we took the painting out of the frame, we realized that the painting had been severely changed. And you can see, oh, well, wait a minute, here's the arrow. You can see there's a different color sky, there's kind of a brighter sky, there's kind of a cloud, instead of this kind of gray mass. And so we're wondering, why would he have changed the painting? There was a lot of controversy when it was exhibited. When the Evening Post declared it admirable, and the Tribune said damnable. So, and you know, an artist feels this. So some of the criticism, he has but little knowledge of nature, the proof of which is at hand in the cloud drawing of the present picture. Pretty mean. The combined mist and sunlight produce a sort of mother of pearl effect in the whole landscape, which, though pretty, is not natural. So obviously, Bierstadt read these criticisms. So we started looking up in the old newspapers. If you go to newspaper.com, you can read anything. We started looking up in the old newspapers what had been said about the painting while it was on view in New York. He had a studio in New York, in kind of near Greenwich Village, and he had the painting there. People could come and see it for money that he donated to the widows of the Civil War. But when we started looking at the description of the sky, we realized there was a change that had taken place. In May, peculiar luminous effects of the sun's rays. The valley and mountains are dotted with spots of sunlight which break through chinks in the clouds. There were no chinks in the clouds. In August, broken clouds floating above the mountain, and then by the time it got to Philadelphia, there was no mention of shafts of sunlight, but rather descriptions that befit the current sky filled with large masses of clouds, rather indefinite in shape. So Bierstadt and his wife went on their own grand tour, sailing for Europe before the painting went to Philadelphia. So if there was any moment when he would have changed the painting, it would have been while it was in his studio. The painting was described in his studio as being in a massive frame, so when he made the change, the painting was already in the frame, so the edge of the old sky you see is still there. So we love these mysteries. That wasn't the only one. When we were looking at the back of the stretcher, we saw this, like, chaps. Who drew that? Why is it there? And nobody could answer that question. But yeah, so you find all kinds of things when you're working on a painting. Even today, the grand paintings evoke a sense of awe. And while it was in our studio, all our friends would come and take selfies, take selfies in front as if they were in the domes of Yosemite. And this week, friends of mine are in Yosemite, and I wanted to send them this picture and say, oh, I've been there. Anyway. So thank you to the Art Care team, which obviously was a huge help in this, to John and his crew, to all my museum colleagues, and especially to newspapers.com. So this is the moment where you get to ask questions. And I'm going to let you look at the domes of Yosemite while you ask.
So Rusty, how long did it take your team to restore it, and what did it cost?
That's a good question. I tried to look up our contract, because the contract included everyone going to Vermont, fixing it, staying in a hotel, flying there and back, and so there were a lot of expenses involved, buying a big sonotube, renting a truck, whatever. I know that the museum in Winter Park gave $100,000, so it must have been more than $100,000. And it took, I think it came in the fall, and it was in the winter, so 4 or 5 months that it went to Winter Park. Yeah, we really focused on it because we didn't have room to work on anything else.
Hello, I have a question. I have an old, probably 100-year-old oil painting. It's probably 8 feet by 5 feet, not by a famous artist, just kind of sentimental. Mm-hmm. And I've been told it should be cleaned. How old, I mean, how much money do you think I would need to spend
to
really have that done?
It so depends on the condition of the painting. If it's just cleaning, it's not so much time. Our day rate is like $5,000 a day, so it takes a day. But where are you from?
From Toledo.
Okay. Cleveland. I can have, my sister used to be the head painting conservator at the Cleveland Museum, and she has colleagues there that work on paintings, so you could probably, if you see me after, I'll tell you.
Thank you, Rusty.
Sure.
Western art seems to have gone out of style, at least in the modern days. There's no Bierstadt today or no Remington today. That maybe there is, and I just don't know about it. But I have been to the Gilcrease Museum, and is it in Tulsa, I believe? It's beautiful, and I would highly recommend that anybody interested in Western art, if they're in that area, certainly it's worth your time. So, question about why is it going out of style?
When I did my graduate work in conservation at Harvard, and we were up on the top floor of the Fogg Museum because I went to class and worked in the conservation department. And they hid the American curator up in our upstairs. There was even, and this was in the early 70s, there was no interest even in American art altogether. So, of course, now, you know, but there are some museums of Western art. There's one in Georgia. There's one, I think, in Sarasota, or no, St. Pete. And every year, they have an event for painters of Western art out in, I think, Colorado, where people dress up as cowboys, ride horses, and you get to sketch them and make paintings that go to these museums. So there's certainly still interest and enthusiasm. And, yeah, no accounting for taste.
Thank you for your talk. What's been your favorite painting, or one of your favorites to work on, and why?
That's a hard question. Whatever I'm working on is my favorite because I get so invested and involved in it and think about it 24/7. The last painting I restored was a Rubens on copper, little Rubens of the Lamentation. But, you know, I worked at the Met, so there's, you know, some of the paintings there still stick in my memory.
Thanks, Rusty. Where does this artist, this work, his work, how does that fit into like the Hudson River Valley movement? Because those grand landscapes, you know, how does this all come together? That's the first question. The second question is, given how much this painting traveled and how large it was and how unwieldy it was it in the condition you expected? Was it worse? Was it better?
The first question, Bierstadt is considered a Hudson River forerunner or even a Hudson River painter because he painted into the 20th century. And not the Hudson River, but the idea of the landscape and the beauty of the country. The condition of the painting, when I showed the old tear, and it wasn't surprising to see that there was a lot of knocks on the painting, but the main problem was that the whole top tacking fold had broken and the painting was just falling off the stretcher. So that couldn't continue. When people stopped saying, "Oh, this painting is so wonderful," and started saying, "What's wrong with it?" they knew they had to treat it.
Thank you. Rustin, when you take the varnish off, then do you reapply some protective surface after the old varnish comes off?
Yes, we do. In this case, I didn't show the picture, but we did it in the studio. We had to make a big tent. We had to wear a white suit to protect us and masks, and we sprayed it with a synthetic resin.
We've had art preservationists come here from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and particularly one that was very involved in frames for pictures like this.
Last year.
And you had one slide here which showed a massive frame. I wonder if you could flip back to that and describe who decides how big the frame and what kind of frame they're going to have in a museum.
Not me. My interest is that the frame be very protective of the work so that there's no way, you know, that it doesn't press on the tacking edge. So it's, we use felt inside. But, all right, let me go back. And I think in one of the pictures, yeah, in this picture you can see this frame was made for the domes when it went to St. Johnsbury. It's really big, and it has this whole base. And a frame restorer did come and treat the frame. And then, yeah, this frame was original to the painting, so the consideration is that the frame be of the era of the painting, or at least represent the era if you can't find an original frame, and that it would be something the artist would feel appropriate. There are artists that don't, especially contemporary artists, want just, narrow frames. They don't want anything to distract from the work, especially if it's an abstract. But Van Gogh, for example, when they first opened the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, they used the original frames. He didn't have any money. And so they were just these kind of gray moldings, and people couldn't get over how bad the paintings looked in these frames, even though they were Van Gogh's idea of a frame. And now they have changed the frames because the frames were so unflattering, and it wasn't necessarily an aesthetic decision, it was an economic decision in that case. Does that answer your question?
Do the members of your team have certain specialties, or is it all covered under art conservation studies? If so, what are the specialties?
We're all painting conservators, and there's graduate programs that people are trained in. Oliver, for example, is an expert in structural treatment of paintings. He can make a tear disappear with a needle and a little adhesive. He's incredible. And Veronica's an amazing retoucher. It just, varies. So within conservation, we have some specialties, but it's all about paintings. And everyone has some kind of graduate training in conservation. There's a lot to it, the history, the chemistry. Don't try this at home kind of thing.
Thank you very much, Rusty.
Sure.
Thank you.